Hey, I'm NerdChomp, and I'm making a game called Imago. It's a roguelike 3D platformer where you absorb bug abilities, cocoon bugs to upgrade them, and adapt your strategy when your bugs inevitably die. It is day 5 of Imago Week. If you don't know what Imago Week is, I made a video explaining it on Sunday, so you can watch that first. In this video, I will be talking about Imago's new level generator. But first, let's take a look at older versions and see how it's evolved. The original prototype version of the level generator was completely random. All it was a bunch of platforms on a square grid with randomized heights and randomized gaps. As you progressed through the harder levels, the vertical distance between the platforms increased, and the chance of gaps forming increased. There were also a few special platform types thrown in, but that was a basic system. While playtesting this version, the common complaint was that impossible situations would pop up, which made the game feel unfair at times. To address that, I completely revamped the system. I have another video covering that in depth. But to summarize, I used a maze algorithm, specifically the recursive backtracking algorithm, to ensure there is always a possible path to the end no matter where you are on the map. I also replaced the square grid with a hexagonal grid, randomizing the positions of their corners for visual variety. And I also added these little ledge things to make the grid look more natural. And while it certainly looked more natural than the prototype, I was never fully happy with how it looked. At certain angles it looked nice, but at others, it still just looked like a bunch of hexagons. Which brings us to my current version of the level generator. I got inspired by Stalberg. I know I'm probably mispronouncing that, so I apologize, but if you don't recognize that name, he is the creator of a little game called Townscaper. It's what he calls an instant town building toy, where you place houses one by one to build a town. It's basically Legos with houses. So what's so special about this game, and how did it inspire Imago? Well, Townscaper is a grid-based game, but if you look closely, it's not an ordinary grid. It bends and flows and loops back on itself to create a very natural-looking, European-style city layout. That's because Oscar Stalberg wasn't satisfied with the traditional grid, so he developed his own custom method for grid generation. The result is the Stalberg grid. I wanted to use the Stalberg grid to give my levels a more natural layout. So how does the Stalberg grid work? It's actually pretty simple. The process starts with a grid of triangles. Oscar Stalberg uses a triangulated hexagon, but I opted to use predetermined rows and columns of triangles instead, just to give me more control over the size of the grid. Then, I randomly remove edges from the grid to merge these triangles into quads. I do this until there are no more adjacent triangles. There will still be a few scattered triangles, but that's okay. Next, I bisect all cells in the grid, both quads and triangles, drawing a line from the center of the cell to each edge of the cell. This transforms all triangles and all quads into smaller quads. And the last step is to implement a relaxation algorithm to smooth out the angles and make the shapes more uniform. The result is a flowing grid with curves and bends made up entirely of quads. Since this style of grid uses quads, I switched back from hexagons to square tiles, and I used dynamic mesh components to stretch the tiles to fit the deformed grid. I used the same maze algorithm I was using before to assign each grid cell as either a wall cell or a path cell. Path cells should always be reachable for the player, whereas wall cells have more flexibility in their placement. They can be placed up high and out of reach, or they can be removed altogether to create a gap. The idea is that even without any additional player abilities, the player can always travel to the path cells, but if the player gets other abilities, they might be able to take shortcuts through the wall cells. To determine the height of the platforms, instead of making them completely random, I now use Perlin noise to drive the heights. The advantage of Perlin noise is that it's not just a random noise. There are gradual transitions between the highs and lows, which provide nice transitional jumping paths for the player. I have one shallow Perlin map for the path cells to ensure the variation isn't too high for the player to jump, and I use a separate Perlin map with a harsher multiplier for the wall cells, since a traversable path isn't as important. I offset the wall cells from the path cells by a certain height to create tall walls surrounding the path, which I can increase or decrease depending on the level of difficulty. But if I just take the raw float value from the Perlin noise, I'll get platforms that are sometimes spaced at awkward increments. If the player can't reach something, I want it to be clear. I want to avoid ambiguity. I also want to avoid tiny, insignificant height changes. So instead of taking a raw float value, I set predetermined stepped heights. These stepped height increments are determined by the jump height of the player. I know how high the player can jump, so I can determine with more control which platforms are within reach and which aren't. Since we're back to quads, I didn't want my platforms to be simple squares. Square platforms just look too obvious and unnatural. I wanted a way to have custom shapes that can still conform to the grid, which means building a tile set that I can seamlessly fit together. If you look up videos about tile sets, you might find this one, which says you need 15 tiles to cover all configurations you would need, Or you might find this one, which says you only need 5 tiles, because some of those 15 tiles are just rotations of each other. And even Oscar Stalberg says you need 5 tiles, 6 if you include a blank tile. But all of these videos are for 2D games, using tile sets to determine a texture that is displayed on a 2D sprite. In that situation, putting the edge of a platform at the edge of a tile causes awkward situations that are difficult to deal with. This edge of the tile can't overhang into the next tile, so they move the edge to the middle of the tile, which gives them more flexibility and results in these 5 tiles. But that's not how I'm using tile sets. My tiles are not driving a texture on a sprite, it's driving the 3D geometry of the level. And because I'm using world space coordinates instead of UV coordinates for the material of the platforms, overlapping tiles don't matter. You don't even notice that the tiles are overlapping, which means I can cut these 5 tiles down to 4. But looking even closer, both of these tiles are essentially just 2 variants of the same tile, with 2 connecting opposite corners. One is concave and one is convex, but in my case, I don't care if it's concave or convex, so to cover any configuration for me, I only need 3 tiles, and then to add variation, I can make different variants of these tiles and randomize which one I use. To place the tiles, the spots I really care about are the height transitions. So in my maze algorithm that assigns the platform heights, I look at the points where 4 different heights meet each other, I analyze those heights in relation to each other, and then I determine which tile needs to be placed. I place tiles as dynamic mesh components, and then I stretch the mesh to fit the custom grid. I do this for every layer of the incremented heights. Now all of this is quite performance heavy, so I ended up learning the basics of C++ so I could implement this new system without any blueprints. Coding this in C++ has definitely helped, but there are still some hitches, so I'm hoping to find more ways to smooth those out. I'm sure my current code is not the most efficient, so I will probably go back and refactor at some point. But it works for now. It produces a clear main path, and I can make walls taller or shorter, or remove them completely to create gaps. But this is when I realized a big level design problem. In an attempt to avoid impossible levels, I had created a system that makes the main path the easy path. So even if you do have the proper abilities to traverse the walls, there's really no incentive to do so, because it's easier to just stay on the path. The difficulty between the path and the walls should be flipped. The main path should be treacherous and filled with danger, but still technically possible, and if you have the right abilities, you should be rewarded with an alternate path to bypass those dangers. There are many ways for me to make the main path harder, like adding traps or other environmental dangers. I will have 4 different biomes, and the mechanism for difficulty will vary between those biomes, but this is the desert canyon biome, so I thought a good way to make a canyon more difficult is to add deep chasms that you need to jump across. So I made these chasm tiles that require more precise platforming, and then depending on the difficulty, I can determine the percentage that one of these chasm tiles will spawn in the place of a normal one. I decided to slightly oversize my tiles, making sure to maintain any connection points that any tiles have. Oversizing my tiles results in some of these natural looking cliff sides, which I thought looked nice. I have a data table to control parameters for the level generator, so I can make walls higher or add more gaps, or make the level really flat. There's a lot of flexibility. And here is the final result. I'm quite happy with it. It looks far more natural and has far more functionality than my old system. There are still a few repeating tile patterns you can notice if you pay close attention. But that's really not a huge deal, and I can always add more tile variations in the future if I want. Tomorrow is day 6 of Imago week, and I will release a video covering the dreaded topic of UI, which is something I struggle with a lot. So tune in tomorrow to see how I'm doing with that. The Steam page for Imago is up and active, so you can head over there and wishlist the game. It really helps me out a lot. Link in the description. Thanks.